Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political analysis show. Since we are in that limbo between Christmas and New Year's, I was thinking, like last year, I discussed some of the elections that we're looking toward next year in 2026 across the world. So, first, we have the American elections here in November. Obviously, we talked a lot about that already. Not too much more that I want to say here that I haven't said already, other than that this will determine the remainder of Donald Trump's term in office and what kind of legislative accomplishments he can push through after the November midterms. And Trump on the issues is deeply unpopular. The key one that I pay attention to is the approval on the economy and the overall generic ballot. Probably once a month for the next few months we'll be looking at polling as we head into the next election. But for now, know that Democrats hold a small but consistent lead over Republicans on the generic ballot, and Atlas Intel is definitely an outlier. As you can see, I have on screen a list of polls, and you can definitely see that it's an outlier. I would say at this point, if an election were held today, it would probably be a 6 to a 7 point lead, maybe 4 or 5, depending on where the undecided voters go. Usually undecided voters tend to go to whichever party is in the ascendancy nationally, which would be Democrats. Then you have Trump's approval on the issues. So there is not a whole lot of great news on this one, at least if you're a Republican. The immigration remains to be the most important issue, or at least the most popular issue. That's a very base issue. About minus 10% on immigration. And by the way, all these numbers here, they're from the Silver Bulletin. The economy, as I said, is probably the top one that I look at. It's about minus 20.5, which is pretty bad. Trade is minus 21.3, and inflation is almost minus 30. It's at minus 28. So that is not good news, and I don't think that that's going to improve much over the year. We'll have to wait and see on that one, but usually it goes down and down and down. And if you're a longtime viewer of this show, you'll remember that I said back in January and February that this was the most powerful that Trump would ever be. And when I said this, I meant back in January and February. I said his power was going to weaken as time went on. Next, I want to move down south to Brazil, where President Luiz Inacio Lula da Silva is running for a fourth non-consecutive term, and it would be his second and last consecutive term. Brazil is most similar to America in terms of Latin American countries, and it is a large country with a diverse population. It has a history of slavery like we do, and unfortunately a history of abuse against Native Americans, I guess. I don't know what they would call them down there, indigenous people. However, I think 2024, the year that was our year, could be 2026 for them. President Jair Bolsonaro, the former president who helped conduct an insurrection at the Capitol on January 8, 2023, has been jailed and barred from running in this election, hence why Trump tariffed Brazil so hard. Problem with Lula is that, like Joe Biden, he's 80 years old and he has health issues. Some on the left in Brazil are concerned about letting him run again, but like we had in the States last year, there weren't really anything that they could do about it because there were no viable alternatives to rally around. Lula was immensely popular back during his first presidency in the 2000s, but in the polarized world that we live in, he is only barely more approved than he is disapproved. He originally said he wouldn't run for another term, but here we are. The economy is not doing so hot, and inflation is running at about 5%, which is decent there. It's a little on the high end. I think they usually have inflation at about 4%, and crime remains a big issue in Brazil. Brazil will have its first round in October, and then they will have a runoff in late October. Lula will easily make the runoff if he's on the ballot, but it's unlikely he will garner 50% of the vote outright. The opposition on the right is split, so it remains to be seen if Lula can squeeze through the middle. Next, I want to move on to Canada, and you might wonder, wait a second, didn't Canada have an election this past year? Yes, they did. However, I think chances are very high there will be another election later this year. And they don't have fixed election dates in their country like we do here and in Brazil. Canada will see an election. If there's no election triggered, the mandatory maximum deadline will be October of 2029, which is still 3 years away. Actually, it's 4 years away. Prime Minister Mark Carney is running a minority government. At least at the moment, he's only one seat short of a majority, and even if he does get an extra seat, it's been very controversial. He's been picking members off the opposition and bringing them into his party. And even if he does get to that majority, either through picking off members of the other party or they resign and their seats are not filled, it would still be a fragile majority. A minority government means that more than half of the legislature, in part or in whole, is against him. So I would expect an election because the opposition parties seem united against him at this moment. As of right now, the Liberals have a small lead in the polls. It's about 41% to about 39%. This would likely translate into an election results that are similar to what they have right now. And the left-wing New Democrats are at about 8%, and the Quebec Bloc are about 7%. So they might pull a few seats away from the Liberals because they only got 6% in the last election. They only stand candidates in Quebec, which makes me think that things are not going to change too much. However, the left-wing NDP picks a new leader in March, and once that happens, I expect things to move very quickly. More on that in the future, I guess. So let's move over to Europe. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban is running behind in the polls against the opposition Peter Mayer. The polls are tight, and at this point it looks like there will be a hung parliament with Orban's Fidesz party as the largest party. The government's polls show them ahead, of course, and the opposition's polls and independent pollsters show the opposition ahead. Hungary is a little bit strange because Orban has been in power for 16 straight years, and they have seen democratic backsliding. Orban is an ally of Russia, and considering that Hungary borders Ukraine and Ukraine borders Russia, it would be good news for Ukraine to see an opposition win in Hungary. For example, Orban said he was unsure about who started the war in Ukraine, clearly trying to play a little bit of both sides. Meanwhile, the new TISA party is the main opposition. They currently have 0 seats in the National Assembly, but did win some seats in the last year in the European parliamentary elections. They are conservative, populist, however they are center-right and pro-Europe. Meanwhile, Orban is nationalist, Christian nationalist, against European Union integration and against immigration, and he is very far right. So the left doesn't really have a voice in Hungary. However, the opposition is more left-wing than Orban, so it would make sense if they gravitate toward the opposition. And in general, it would be good for democracy to see Orban falls because his government has implemented censorship and has tried to remove checks and balances and generally consolidated power in the hands of the president and prime minister. Next, I want to move to Spain. Now, Spain is not supposed to have an election until 2027, but once again, I think there is a decent chance that there could be an election before then. Right now, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has a minority government, and that has been deeply unstable, and they have been beset by scandal like sexual misconduct allegations and corruption. His party was re-elected, quote-unquote, in 2023, and the reason I'm hesitant to say re-elected is because the party was not even the largest party. Spain's Socialist Workers' Party, or the PSOE, was actually in second place, but the right-wing vote was split between the People's Party, which are more moderate, and they're led by Alberto Núñez Feijóo, and the far-right Vox, led by Santiago Abascal. Without getting too much into it, the Spanish economy is actually doing quite well, but the government, as I said, is plagued by corruption and sex scandals and other scandals, which has really dragged down their polling numbers. So they're managing the economy well. It's the PR that's the problem. Still, though, they are only about 4 points behind the People's Party, as you can see on the polls on screen. The People's Party is at about 30%, and the PSOE is at about 26%, and the opposition Vox has been rising at about 18%. Spain is not like a Westminster democracy where all the opposition needs to do is pull the plug on the prime minister as it is in the UK and Canada. Instead, the opposition needs to propose an alternative prime minister, and that's very unlikely because the balance of power is held by the nationalists in Catalonia. So I'm thinking the only way they would get an election is if the right-wing vote splits more and more and Sanchez takes the lead in the polls. And I still think a majority government is unlikely, but if Sanchez can take the lead in the polls again, he's been behind for years, then he might trigger an early election. Who knows? That's the only way I think we're going to get one. So as long as he remains behind in the polls, I do not expect an early election call until the summer of 2027. So once again, if Sanchez hangs on, there will not be an election until August of 2027. To show just how unstable they are, they haven't passed a budget since 2023, and the government has been rolling over for the last few years that same budget. And since Sanchez has no majority in the legislature, it's unlikely they're ever going to pass a new one until an election is called. This is a problem because Spain is a member of NATO and Trump wants to increase defense spending, and they need to increase defense spending by 5% of GDP by 2035, and right now it is less than 2%. Next, and I think this will be one of international importance, and I'm most looking forward to this, and that's the Israeli elections. Since well before the war started, Benjamin Netanyahu has been pressured to resign or call early elections. The war has helped him delay that. However, he's reaching the legal maximum of his term in office in October, and there has to be new elections then. As of this moment, his Likud party is ahead in the polls, but his whole governing coalition is behind, and we could see a new prime minister in Israel next year, and therefore a new direction in the war. Naftali Bennett seems to be a good choice for prime minister. He was prime minister briefly a couple of years ago. Benjamin Netanyahu has proved to be a political warrior and a survivor, so I think getting rid of him will not be easy. At the same time, the opposition remains deeply divided, and who knows, Israel might still be governed by Benjamin Netanyahu for another 4 years. So those are the biggest ones. I would also recommend watching the presidential election in Colombia. Their president is term limited and has had a few arguments with Trump recently. New Zealand, Peru, and Armenia, as well as a few others. With a very nationalistic administration here in the States, and with Latin America turning to the right more recently in countries like Argentina, in Chile, and El Salvador, it's certainly helpful to the Trump administration to have a similar ideology when dealing with things like drugs and crime. That could make this more cohesive. For example, as I said, in the last few years, we've seen victories for the right-wingers in Honduras, El Salvador, the United States, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. And next year, as I said, Lula faces a big test, and there's going to be elections in Peru and Colombia, which appears that right-wingers will win. Many of these elected presidents have chosen to follow policies of the El Salvadorian dictator Nayib Bukele, and in Latin America in particular, like here, the most important issues were economic. Crime wasn't a big issue here, but it was inflation, and then crime is another issue. Alrighty, so that is all I have for this episode and for the year 2025. I can't believe it's over, so if you've been here the whole time, I want to thank you so much. If you have been along the entire way, that's awesome. I hope you have an amazing 2026. If you're new, I also hope you have an amazing 2026, and it's going to be a great year. I plan to have episodes the entire year, and please let me know and your thoughts in the comments below down as always. And lastly, I hope you all return next week. It's going to be our 100th episode, so that's super exciting. I was kind of hoping the 100th episode would have been in December, but it's actually turned out to be next year, so 2026, so stay tuned on January 5th, 2026 for our 100th episode. So see you all then. Bye-bye.